Welcome back to the Magnolia Media Podcast. I'm your host, Jonathan M. Ruggiero. And let's dive right into it as we have a lot of news to cover, beginning with the New York Times. Maggie Haberman and Jonathan Swan came together on this particular report. The report says Tucker Carlson contacted Donald Trump about 2 weeks before the shooting this past weekend to warn him that if he chose Doug Burgum or Marco Rubio as his vice presidential picks, the intelligence community and the United States of America would assassinate him because they are the type of Republican that, well, the intelligence service would prefer, not, outright traitors. They just play traitors on TV. So he went with J.D. Vance, someone who is, well, even more extreme than Donald Trump. This coupled with a threat from Iran. Iran also threatened Donald Trump because of his attack on Lieutenant General Soleimani in 2020 when Soleimani was in Iraq. His vehicle was struck and he was killed. They have now said they will seek retribution against Donald Trump. Now, as for the young J.D. Vance, 1 year my junior, he is the least known of the three candidates who were in the running for the vice presidential nomination from Dementia J convicted felon Donald Trump. Only 27% of Republicans even know who the hell J.D. Vance is. He has far less name recognition than Marco Rubio, and surprisingly, a sufficient number of Republicans actually knew who the hell Doug Burgum was. CNN also reports that Joe Scarborough from the Morning Joe show on MSNBC was taken off the air on Monday out of fear from NBC, big NBC, that he might say something inflammatory about this Klan rally taking place in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, that they call the RNC. Well, Joe hit back on Tuesday, calling them out on air, saying that if something like that ever happened again, he would simply walk out, and the most popular show, other than Rachel Maddow, would cease to exist. I see no problem with that. Now, as much as I disagree with MSNBC taking Joe Scarborough off the air because they're worried about what some deplorable people might say about Joe Scarborough and his show, or how they might feel about Joe Scarborough and his show, is, well, repulsive. It's caving to Republican pressure, and it's probably happened, well, every year there's been a presidential election since MSNBC was created. After all, it was supposed to be the left-wing answer to Fox News. It has failed miserably at becoming that, as every truly liberal broadcaster who's ever worked on that network has been fired. In fact, the weekend lineup is led by former RNC chairman Michael Steele, and the weekday coverage is kicked off with former Republican congressman who carried water for the Bush administration in Florida in 2000, Joe Scarborough, who can't help but marry other people's wives. I see no problem with letting Mika Brzezinski take over that show, because I don't believe Joe Scarborough is going to say anything really that defamatory about Republicans in the first place. Maybe, just maybe, she and Willie might, because there was no need, no point at all in showing any deference to these people who, well, they want us to imagine have turned over a new leaf, that they're good, kind, and decent people, despite the fact that same night and Tuesday night, they stood and chanted, F Joe Biden. That sounds like a really remorseful crowd, doesn't it? A crowd that has learned its lesson about all of this toxic language that they spew all over the place, this toxic language that has taken hold of what was once the Republican Party, what was once the party of Lincoln. Well, the party of Lincoln has been dead since about 30 years after his assassination, and it's turned into a party of one man, a demagogue, as we watched one Republican after another debase themselves, walk across the stage, and give fiery speeches in support of a man we know they hate in real life. The thing is, the stupid who make up the MAGA faithful can't tell reality from fiction any longer. So as obvious as those speeches were to those of us who don't support this fascist takeover of the United States, it was just more confirmation for the stupid white people who are attracted to the politics of grievance, of vengeance, of outright hatefulness, and a license to be hateful, because that is, after all, is what Donald Trump is. So, I hope that if Joe Scarborough is ever taken off the air because they're worried that he might hurt someone's feelings, 2 days after an attempt on Donald Trump's life, an attempt he didn't take serious, an attempt that left one Trump supporter dead, Joe Biden did call the wife of that Trump supporter, who heroically jumped in front of a bullet to protect his family, because she said she wanted to keep her promise to her deceased husband. However, her God King, Donald Trump, has yet to call. No notice from the Trump campaign. No one here cares. Knock on another door, lady, because Trump doesn't care about you. He cares about staying out of prison, and the only way to do that is to be elected president again, something the United States of America can't handle. Well, the Biden critique that he can't speak without a teleprompter has, well, been sort of blown up. Or at least it includes MAGA Speaker Mike Johnson, who says, well, the teleprompter just broke in the middle of his convention speech. It also happened to Russian plant, you remember him, the senator from Wisconsin, Ron Johnson, who had a, say, softer, more compelling speech prepared on the teleprompter, but no hard copy of the speech. And the speech he had memorized, the America is garbage, the American carnage style speech, was the one he went with instead. So as for the Speaker of the House, MAGA Mike Johnson, and for Wisconsin Senator Ron Johnson, I guess they're too old. They can't speak without a teleprompter. They don't know what to say other than just stand there and look stupid, which is, unfortunately, Ron Johnson and MAGA Mike, who are not related, as far as we know. Well, they need to retire too, because they're just too old. They can't speak without a teleprompter telling them what to say. They certainly can't get up there and say what they really think. Speaking of Joe Biden and the consternation that has circled around his candidacy for President of the United States, 538 has developed a model to determine who would win if there were 100 races run this November and not just one. And in 53 of their models, 53 out of 100, Joe Biden beats Donald Trump. This, despite the fact, in Virginia, it's a tied race at the top. Virginia, a blue state, a 10-point state for Democrats, more or less every election cycle anymore, shows Democratic Senator Tim Kaine well ahead of his rival, but with Biden struggling to break even with Donald Trump. At this point, I have become agnostic on the calls for Biden to step down or for Biden to stay in. I like the things Joe Biden has done. I think he has an excellent record. I don't know why he would want to be president at age 86. But, there was a time and a place for all of this. For all of this debate about what to do and who to go forward with and whether to support Joe Biden or not, it was called the Democratic primary. And we really didn't have a fair and open Democratic primary, did we? Perhaps Gavin Newsom and Josh Shapiro and Gretchen Whitmer and all the names being thrown around now, Kamala Harris included, should have, primaried Joe Biden. So we wouldn't be in the position we're in at this current moment. But I digress. And again, Biden says he'll be attacking the Supreme Court of the United States as he builds his campaign back up. That the Supreme Court will be attacked as much as the Trump campaign will be attacked. This coming via MSNBC from one of the chairpeople of the Biden campaign, Delaware Senator Chris Coons. Coons is saying that they're going to put the Supreme Court on trial. I say this: Biden is now unshackled. Biden could go on attacking the Supreme Court and their incredibly irresponsible decision to make presidents kings and to strip women of their bodily autonomy, to overturn Chevron and say that, the EPA and other agencies really don't have the power to, check the industries they were congressionally approved to check and to put measures into place to do things like, preserve clean water and clean air. I say this: why not go ahead and put 6 more justices on the Supreme Court? Now, there's nothing they can do to stop you. You are essentially king. Why not do that at this moment? Just to protect yourself on down the line in case you are the presidential nominee, which it appears Biden will be the presidential nominee, even though it seems that the leadership in the House seems to be really driving the point home that they don't want Biden atop the ticket, as he might cost them some House seats. Nancy Pelosi made a comment about Biden deciding to run, but it's not fair that he might drag down the entire party. Interesting, coming from 84-year-old Nancy Pelosi, who didn't decide to step down as the leader of the Democrats in the House of Representatives until age 83. 83. So, we'll take it from there. The Supreme Court has been completely out of step, and I think it's a great idea for him to put the Supreme Court on trial, put them out front and center, put them on display, and warn every American what will happen if Trump is elected a second time. The Supreme Court will go so far right, we're talking about a 7-2 court if Justice Sotomayor decides to step down, or Clarence Thomas and Samuel Alito finally retire, leaving him 2 more justices to replace that he can replace with 40-year-olds or 50 at the oldest. So for the next 30, 40 years, we'll be stuck with an extreme activist, politically motivated, Christo-fascist Supreme Court. Now, I'm not sure why Biden won't go forward with this, as the Supreme Court has its worst, most catastrophic polling in its history, as only 38% of the country approve of the Supreme Court and 56% outright disapprove. 56% of the country outright disapproves of the court. You usually have a majority of people with no opinion or duh. I guess that's the mindset and the IQ of the average American these days, as we see them moving towards something as stupid as Donald Trump. So again, I'm now agnostic on Joe Biden and whether or not he should stay in the race. That's really not something I'm going to cover anymore. I'm going to move forward with each and every podcast as if he is the nominee. And we have to take the polling on the chin, and we have to hope for the best. The best thing we can do is get out and vote. Tell a friend. Warn someone. Bring up Project 2025 and the fascistic takeover of America that it lays out in incredible detail. And when Trump tries to separate himself from it, and people pointed out, well, Trump's not really, point out the fact that 200 former Trump staffers, 200, helped design that 900-page nightmare of a document. We don't want Project 2025 in America. It is as un-American as anything we have ever seen. Just as Donald Trump and the modern Republican Party / Ku Klux Klan is as un-American, as anti-American as anything we've ever seen. Clarence Thomas, speaking of the Supreme Court and his mega yacht trip all the way to Russia, and then a private helicopter ride from the mega yacht to a palace in St. Petersburg, likely owned by the dictator Vladimir Putin himself, happens to be Vladimir Putin's hometown, and, he didn't happen to mention that on his disclosure forms. All the more reason to crack down on the Supreme Court, and while you have the power, go ahead and impose. Go ahead and impose your will as King of America on the Supreme Court and demand these people step aside right now. Right now. Either arrest, give them the option to step down and step aside, Clarence Thomas, Sam Alito, or arrest them. They've made you king. They're betting you don't have the backbone to do it, President Biden. They're betting you won't do it. Prove them and prove the country wrong. Prove to them that the ruling they made, the decision they made to promote a president of the United States to king of the United States was the worst thing they've ever done and the last thing they will ever do as justices. In fact, I would only leave Amy Coney Barrett and the 3 liberal justices on the court. And if Judge Sotomayor wants to go, well, Justice, please consider going now. Now, while Democrats have the majority necessary to, stop her from being replaced by another neocon fascist, one who would undoubtedly work to further undermine the standing of the United States of America and the freedom of her citizens. So, if a judge like Sotomayor is going to make a move, now is the time to move it as the Biden administration announces reforms it intends to place on the Supreme Court. And with his new king-like powers, I suppose Biden can do whatever he wants. Well, Republicans threaten, and then threaten, and then threaten. And finally, something tragic happens. On top of that, they blame liberals. They blame liberals for a Republican shooting at a Republican. It's insanity. And Jesse Waters, of course, was quoted as saying that we shouldn't look too much into the young man's political affiliation, his Republican leanings, the Trump signs all over his front yard. However, how would we look at it if he had in fact been a registered Democrat, if he had been on liberal websites, if he had given large amounts of money to liberal causes? I ask you, what would Jesse Waters say then, the little two-faced rat, the man whose career was harassing women who were going to press charges or at least make a fuss over at Fox News about the sexual harassment of Bill O'Reilly? That's who Jesse Waters is. So we can only assume that in 2000 and 2004 and 2008 and 2012, and at least according to Keith Olbermann, they were blackmailed by big NBC, that is MSNBC, into making sure Chris Matthews and Keith Olbermann were nowhere near the debate coverage, or they would have no opportunity to cover Republican debates for the rest of the campaign season. Something to consider. MSNBC has been getting blackballed by NBC for a long, long time. This is nothing new because, again, there is no liberal media in this country. And as far as legacy news outlets go and their credibility among viewers, I would have to say ABC has done the best job. By far, the best Sunday political show isn't Face the Nation, isn't Meet the Press. After Tim Russert's passing, unfortunately, Meet the Press has gone into the proverbial toilet. First with David Gregory, if you can remember that white-haired, former White House correspondent to NBC News, who took over after the untimely death of the great Tim Russert, one of the truly great newsmen in American history, and a man who made that show what it was. They should have canceled Meet the Press and extended their Sunday morning coverage on NBC as soon as he passed, because it has been nothing but, well, I'd have to use a whole bunch of nasty language to describe what has happened over at Meet the Press since Tim Russert's passing, which would be unfortunate for you and unfortunate for me. CNN has done a pretty decent job, although CNN seems to be bending to the fascist party just in case they win, just in case we're thrown into a dictatorship, so maybe they can be part of official state TV. Who knows? We do know that the Times and Post are doing better, as the New York Times had a 5,000-word editorial describing all the reasons why Trump should never be president again. It goes into detail about all of the things that would unravel if he was elected president a second time. Good on the New York Times for finally putting this out there, and good on CNN for picking it up and running with it. Now, on to the Florida documents case. And one final note on the 5,000-word piece done by the New York Times. About goddamn time. Seriously, New York Times. You've got your little hitman, Peter Baker, out there writing these terrible stories, sometimes 3 times a week, about the Biden administration, about Biden's age, about everything Biden has done wrong while he's done nothing but improve the United States dramatically from where it was when he took office, including the healthiest recovery we could have ever imagined. The greatest recovery we could have ever imagined from a crisis like the pandemic. He pulled us out of it. He reduced inflation. The stock market is on fire. Wages are outpacing inflation, and inflation is still at 3%. So that really says something. And I don't know how or why people in the United States, or some majority of them, say that they somehow trust Trump by 20 points, a man who added $2.7 trillion a year to the deficit. The largest deficit spender in non-wartime in U.S. history. The man exploded the United States debt, and he would do it again with more tax cuts for he and his wealthy friends. And if you've noticed, there have been more and more of the old tech bros who used to align themselves with liberals now being drawn in to Trump's orbit, especially apartheid Clyde Elon Musk, the man we love to hate, the man who destroyed, well, what was once probably most of our favorite online platform. And that was, of course, Twitter, before he decided to get into media and discovered he knows nothing about running a media company. Stick to rockets, big boy. Or, as your family was involved in, the jewel trade in South Africa at a time of apartheid. Who knows what exactly the Musk family might have been up to? Who knows what set him on the path to being the world's richest man, other than an enormous ego and a tiny, I don't know. But anyway, back to the point. Speaking of corrupt, we have to change our gaze for a moment and move it down to Florida. The Florida classified documents case, you know, the one where Trump stole and likely sold classified information to American allies, American enemies, to pretty much anybody who could access a toilet, a bathroom at Mar-a-Lago. Yeah, we've all seen the pictures of the boxes overflowing into the floor. We've all heard the video of the war plans on Iran. Not exactly making things any easier in the Middle East or in this conflict between the Israelis, between the Hamas-led entity in Gaza, among the Hezbollah force in Lebanon. Basically a three-headed war that's going on in the Middle East. So Trump added fuel to that fire, and Bibi Netanyahu is counting on, praying in his own way to Satan, I guess, that Donald Trump is reelected so that he'll get a free pass and he'll get to stay prime minister and he'll get to avoid prison just like the other guy. Because, make no mistake, corrupt judge Eileen Cannon, who dismissed this case, dismissed it because of the constitutionality of a special counsel, which has been reaffirmed by the Supreme Court time and time again. So this will be appealed. This will be picked up by a new judge. The whole process will start over. It won't happen before Election Day, but if we can hold off the fascistic threat coming from this extreme right-wing dictator, then we have a chance of seeing him go on trial in what is the government's strongest case against Donald Trump. There's no question the documents case is a slam dunk. It's going to be hard to find a jury anywhere that wouldn't convict him for what he did to the United States of America when he stole those precious documents. When he stole and even showed to Mark Meadows' biographer war plans to attack Iran. God knows who else he showed, and God knows what happened to some of the contents of those classified folders that are missing. Think about that for a moment. So, when this case comes around again, it will be appointed to a judge. It won't be left up to chance. It won't be on the old roulette wheel where we might end up with someone like an Eileen Cannon, who was sort of appointed to the bench under the cover of night. Just sort of real quick like. You know, just slide her in there when we kind of know Trump's going to lose or right after Trump lost to act as a blockade in case a federal case came his way. It's not as if Donald Trump didn't know that he was going to be in a lot of trouble and that any case against him based in Florida would have to be filed in Florida. Not to mention this case could also be picked up in New Jersey, where Trump doesn't have an Eileen Cannon. That's not to say he wouldn't end up with a corrupt judge, but it is to say that as this case has been dismissed, it will go to the 11th Circuit. The 11th Circuit will get it started all over again. They'll probably appoint it to a more experienced judge, probably stay in the South Florida, Miami area and not in little old podunk Port Arthur out in the middle of nowhere where she was the senior most judge, allowing all of these motions by Trump to back up. It would take her months at the pace she was going to even begin to shuffle through them. So, we know this. If Trump is not elected, he will spend the rest of his life in prison because of that documents case. For all we know, he could end up with 200 years for the things he has done to jeopardize the security of the United States and, again, her citizens. So let's just give that a little bit of thought. Now, from the KKK rally called the RNC in Milwaukee, which has been an absolute disaster, Trump sits up in a box and watches as one traditional Republican who challenged him during the primary after another gives a fiery speech where they are completely and 100% full of shit. and pathetic. Ron DeSantis, who was emasculated by Donald Trump, giving a fiery fake speech using hand gestures and all. And let's not forget about Nikki Haley, who was even attacked for her heritage and race. Yes, she had racist bombs thrown at her by Donald Trump as she challenged him dared to challenge Donald Trump for the 2024 nominee. And J.D. Vance, a Class A bullshitter. I want more attention on J.D. Vance because I happen to represent Appalachia too. And here is the problem with Appalachia. People like J.D. Vance, people who bask in the stupidity, who bask in ignorance, who write moronic books like Hillbilly Elegy that's basically lies, cosplaying what the lives are like of people who live in those areas. And there are very few of them. Most of them live suburban lives these days. There are very, very few people who have anything to do with coal mines anymore, especially in that part of the country. After all, we're talking about Cincinnati. So, we don't know how much he blew it out of proportion, but we do know this. The idea is to keep people in that part of the country as stupid and in the dark as they possibly can, because poor, angry whites is how they win elections, or at least how they win local elections. It shouldn't make that big a difference on a national stage, but, J.D. Vance might help him win some in the West because people were like, no. J.D. Vance is a liability. Perhaps that phone call from old Tucker set Trump into a panic, and he appointed a 39-year-old named J.D. Vance to come in and, be his vice president. We know what he thinks of his vice presidents. After all, he sent a mob to hang Mike Pence on January 6, 2021. They were looking for Mike Pence after they had erected the gallows on the front lawn of the U.S. House of Representatives in front of the U.S. Congress. That's what he thinks of his VPs. So I would just warn J.D. Vance to remember all of those things and all of those emotions he felt about Trump back in 2016 when he was trashing him over and over and over again. I'm not going to play any of those recordings for you here. You can simply look up J.D. Vance, Trump comments 2016, and you will get an incredible result on just about any search browser or on YouTube. And I encourage you to do so you completely understand and can completely bask in the hypocrisy that is Trumpism, that is J.D. Vance. And again, J.D. Vance and his, again, to use the word, bask in his hillbilly upbringing, as I grew up in southern Appalachia too, with a grandmother who came from the side of a mountain in northeastern Tennessee near the Virginia-Kentucky border, a grandfather who grew up in Knoxville, Tennessee in the 1930s and 1940s, people who knew what real hillbilly life was like, not somebody who, like me, was born in the early mid-1980s and didn't see anything that he could really remember or recall until we were well into the 1990s. So don't feed me this nonsense. Don't lie to us anymore, because J.D. Vance is a liar. J.D. Vance sees an opportunity and he grabbed it. He grabbed the opportunity to paint these people, who were his family after all, with the broad brush of being ignorant and stupid, and that's the way it ought to stay. That's the way it's always been here. Ignorant and stupid. No. They were people looking for a place to live. It dates back to 1725, the struggles of Scotch-Irish people to, steal land from the Cherokee Indians and set up a settlement of their own, since they weren't wanted in places like Philadelphia. That's the truth. And exposure to things like, black history, their own history, the history of the indigenous people on whose land we all live. That would be just too much to ask, wouldn't it? For better schools, for a better power grid for those folks. Things that they could actually use, because all they have now is either a Bible or a meth pipe. And in a lot of cases, both. And I'm beginning to wonder about old JD. As I mentioned earlier, Senator Tim Kaine in the state of Virginia is polling way ahead of his Republican challenger. The same goes for Tammy Baldwin in Wisconsin, for Peters in Michigan, for Bob Casey in Pennsylvania, even for the senator in Nevada, even for Ruben Gallego, who will be taking up the seat currently held by Kyrsten Sinema out of the state of Arizona. Sinema, of course, a wolf in sheep's clothing, as she came in, a former Green Party candidate, before we realized the Green Party's headquarters is in Moscow, killed $15 an hour minimum wage and killed many provisions of Biden's Build Back Better, American Rescue Plan, infrastructure plan that would have, done things like extend the child tax credit so that struggling families or families in general, even middle-class families, could use the extra money of not having to wait for one payment a year, but instead get installments based on the age of their children, whether or not their children are in schools, a little extra coin here or there to help people along. But no, she not only had to vote against it, but she had to make a show out of her little vote to make herself feel important in her one term that she spent embedded with Republicans. Well, and Joe Manchin, who's, just a Republican who votes for Democratic judges. Thanks for the judges, Joe. Now you can go back to your mansion. Maybe the only mansion in the whole state of West Virginia. West Virginia is, after all, in terrible shape, and they keep voting for candidates who will make sure that state continues to fail. After all, the largest tax revenue day in West Virginia is a golf tournament, and it's not even a major championship. Think about that. It's a PGA Tour event that's not even a major. So, there's not much there in West Virginia. Maybe we should just close off big parts of the state and make it a wildlife preserve, because I don't know where industry is going to come from. In a 2013 report done by a private corporation that would not give its name, in conjunction with NPR, said that they had looked at putting a plant, a shop, a business, again, we don't know what kind of business it was, in eastern Kentucky, near the West Virginia border, and one of the most depressed parts of the United States. What did their company find? Well, they found that they couldn't do it, that they couldn't count on finding 140 employees who were A, eligible for hire, B, lived within that 140-mile radius, and C, could pass a drug test. So, while Republicans attack major big blue cities where, basically all of the investment has gone, cities where we have focused our energy, where college graduates go to build careers, where people who don't have college degrees go to build careers, where people who want to break into acting, writing, podcasting, radio, God forbid, that's where they go. They go to cities. They move into apartments. They use public transportation. They jump in a cab. They get on the Amtrak. They get on the subway. They don't move out to BFE. More on J.D. Vance. Let's remember this about J.D. Vance. A man who once said about abortion that two wrongs don't make a right. That what society sees as a bad deed, rape, should not be made up for by another bad deed in taking a child's life. Huh. An inconvenience is what he called it. They don't want the inconvenience of having the child. Or perhaps they don't want a child they could possibly never love, or a child that every time they look at would remind them of the man who raped them. I wonder how that'll go over with the hundreds of thousands of women who are rape victims in this country. The thousands of women who have become pregnant because of rapes or incest in this country. J.D. Vance has openly said that it's just an inconvenience to carry a rapist child, and that there should be no exception, because two wrongs don't make a right. There's only one wrong. The other is a decision for a mother and her doctor, not for you, J.D. Vance. Go back to Cincinnati. No one is interested in those talking points. So, we've covered J.D. Vance. We've covered the shooting and the shooter. We've covered what could be a shakeup at the Supreme Court. We've covered my agnosticism about whether or not Joe Biden stays in this race or if he falls out of this race. I don't think that conspiring behind his back with people like Nancy Pelosi are going to do anyone any good. And I don't think the party should go into the convention fractured. Or at least we can't come out of it fractured. We do have to do something about the Thomases and Alitos of this country. As I talked about in the last episode of the Magnolia Media Podcast, Clarence Thomas and his private yacht trip and then his helicopter ride to a palace in the hometown of Vladimir Putin, St. Petersburg, Russia, likely a palace owned by Vladimir Putin, and for all we know, he had dinner with Putin every night he stayed in the old palace. How about that for America's normal, down-to-earth Supreme Court justice who travels the country in a tour bus? It is not a recreational vehicle. It is a tour bus. Millions of dollars have been spent spoiling this judge, getting him used to the life he leads, and hardening his position, his anti-woman, his anti-black agenda, his agenda of pure fascism, his agenda to kill off all social programs in the United States, to make sure that these children who have been forced on women who do, what human beings are programmed, are hardwired to do, and that is to have sex. And women are the only one of the two genders who can become pregnant. Now, again, we're talking about pregnancy here, so I'm not trying to shortchange anybody in the trans community. I'm not trying to pick a fight when I say there are but two genders. Genetically, that's true. A person can identify however they want to. And that brings us full circle back to Elon Musk, who, of course, hates his transgender daughter. Or they have a hate-hate relationship, I guess. And I suppose that's what turned him so hard to the right. A man who has already pushed the limit in supporting Russia over Ukraine by turning off the internet just before Ukraine dealt a lethal blow to the Russian Navy. Think about it. Get back to me. You can always get me on social media, searching Magnolia John 2024 on Instagram. That's where I do most of my work. You can also find me at the Magnolia Media page on YouTube. It's Magnolia John on Twitter X, where I don't go very often, so I probably won't see much of what you post there. It's a toxic cesspool, and until it's sold to someone who can restore it to its former glory, I'm not interested. I'm really not that interested, except as a small part of our marketing here at the Magnolia Media Pod, and I absolutely will not pay Elon Musk for a blue check. The man doesn't need my whatever it is, $6, $8, $10, $12 a month. He supposedly has $200 billion, so let him keep it. While Joe Biden is king of the United States, he should also seize the technology, the Starlink technology, and anything else that is an invention of Elon Musk. No payment for it. Your payment is you don't go to prison for tampering with U.S. operations in Ukraine. You don't go to prison for, well, just about anything we can come up with because we have a king now, not a president. Use that power, President Biden. Use it for good. Use it to push back against people who hope to undermine you, to undermine our allies, to help Russia win, and to sort of Russianize, sort of Soviet Unionize the entire world, making China, Russia, and the United States one, and give up on all of our allies and partners like the Brits, like the Germans, like the French, like the Spanish, like our partners in Northern Europe, like the Dutch, like our partners in Africa, like our partners in Southeast Asia, in Japan, Australia, all of those free democratic nations instead of those fascist nations, those dictatorial nations with state-run media so people don't know what's coming or going. And, of course, cratered economies that have very, very few ways of pulling themselves out. I mean, look at what's happened to China. China has lost 1/3 of its total stock market. 1/3. Think about the catastrophe that would occur if the United States lost 1/3 of all its value, of its GDP, if it just shed it. And by the way, while we're talking about shedding, I do want to throw something out. When I was a kid growing up in the 1980s and early 1990s, we had a PE teacher at my little podunk elementary school out in the middle of the country. I won't mention her name, it doesn't matter anyway. But she used to make us exercise to these videotapes of this man who wore sequenced tank tops and short shorts and white tennis shoes, who had a high-pitched voice and curly hair and an incessant, contagious smile. Even though these were the most annoying workouts in the world, and especially us boys, we'd rather be shooting basketball or throwing a baseball around or doing just about anything else other than, sweating to the oldies. We did. And whether we liked it or not, we learned something from it. So, with all of the chaos and awfulness in the world did lose a truly good person last week. And that was Richard Simmons. Richard Simmons had sort of devolved into sort of a cautionary figure in the last few years. Documentaries have been done about what happened to his life exactly, or the people around him that sort of cut him off from the world around him. But story after story after story has been published and come out talking about people's personal interaction with Richard Simmons and what that meant to them. Well, I'm very happy that Richard Simmons is being remembered in such a positive light. Because again, as sort of a chubby kid in a little country school in the middle of nowhere, for the first time I was exposed to something that I didn't even know I was being exposed to. And it broadened my horizons. Because once I understood the concept of gay and what it meant to be a homosexual, I realized that I learned a long time ago. I learned a long time ago lessons from a gay man, Richard Simmons. Richard Simmons was able to reach people in a way few others have been able to reach him. If he had been an openly gay man who talked about his sexuality on a regular basis, there's no way my PE teacher would have shown his exercise videos enthusiastically, leading the march as we march to the oldies and Richard Simmons' little dances. There's no way my little country Christian school would have ever allowed for that. But he didn't talk about it. He lived his life. He kept his head down. He kept his nose clean. And he truly wanted to help people, especially kids. He didn't want more chubby children. He didn't want more children at risk for diabetes, more children at risk for hypertension and high cholesterol and blood pressure problems and all the things that come along with it, because he had grown up that way. Richard Simmons wanted something better. And maybe, just maybe, we can take a lesson from Richard Simmons. Maybe not a big lesson, but a lesson. That kindness and decency and enthusiasm for what you're doing can help you change the world. And believe me, I have enough material to go on for another, we're at 52 minutes now, for another 52 minutes, easily. To talk about Biden, the Supreme Court, the corruption of the Republican Party that has become nothing more than a glorified version of the Ku Klux Klan, that has become nothing more than America's Nazi Party, that is fascistic in almost every way. We could do that. But, again, at some point we just sort of have to draw the line and call it a day. I will be back day after tomorrow with another episode. We always have an episode available for you at midnight on Friday night, Saturday morning, or first thing Saturday morning while you're having your coffee. Tune in to the Magnolia Media Podcast. If you want to support us, again, check out my Instagram account. We need to get that sucker up. Our first goal is to break 5,000. We want to break 5,000 followers at Magnolia John 2024 on Instagram, on Threads. We want to get to 1,000 listeners a month on this podcast. And I did a live today, which was actually quite encouraging. We had a lot of people passing the podcast around. So, again, I thank each of you for tuning in to the Magnolia Media Podcast. If you want to support our work, you can go to patreon.com/Magnolia Media Network. The only difference is it's Magnolia Media Network. And give $5. When we get to 500, I'll start doing a Friday show just for you guys behind that paywall, sent to your email, that, well, doesn't hold back at all, as if I hold back all that much. I do have quite a foul mouth. I'll apologize in advance, but it will be in that newsletter for paying members of the Magnolia family. And again, we appreciate you so much for tuning in to the Magnolia Media Podcast. Again, I'm your host, Jonathan M. Ruggiero. Until next time, be well.